This is the Cycling Over 60 podcast, Season 2, Episode 57, Beyond the Ordinary Bike Frame with Lennard Zinn, and I'm your host, Tom Butler. Welcome to this week's episode. I'm here to share the conversations I'm having about staying fit in my 60s, and also discussions about a wide variety of cycling topics. First, here's a brief update on my progress this season. I've got a little over a week before I head out to ride across Washington. The wildfires seem to be mostly out, and the skies are clear of smoke. The road is open, and the weather looks like it's going to be great. So the only thing keeping me from making it across Washington is my legs. I want to be open about the fact that I am a little nervous about this trip. It's possible that I have taken on more than I can handle. I'm not worried about doing 400 miles in 5 days. I think I can handle that. It's the 25,000 feet of elevation gain that has me questioning if I can make it all the way across the state. Both the miles and the climbing are far beyond what I've ever done before. And I'm also feeling more apprehensive about being so inexperienced at this kind of riding. Of course, I am being followed by my wife in the car, but there will be long sections when I have no cell phone coverage. If something happens in one of those sections, I'm not sure how to get help. Now, none of my questions are going to stop me from doing day one. And I guess maybe that's the best way of approaching the whole ride. Just take it one section, one day at a time. If you have listened to the podcast for a while, you know that a little less than a year ago, I started wearing a continuous glucose monitor, typically called a CGM. The data from the monitor pushed me to understand my health in a different way. The CGM has been extremely helpful from the moment I started wearing it. To get a CGM, I had to go through a process to get diagnosed with something that would warrant using it. I was able to do that, but the cost of the sensor was around $200 a month. When it was announced last March that an over-the-counter CGM had been approved by the FDA, I was immediately interested. Last week, it finally became available for purchase. The Dexcom Stelo is available without a prescription now. It's called a, quote, glucose biosensor, not a continuous glucose monitor. But it does continuously monitor glucose, so I'm curious why the focus on biosensor. The savings isn't as much as I would have hoped, but it is a little less than half of what I was paying. So that is a step in the right direction. If you do a monthly subscription with Dexcom, it is $90 a month. I originally got my CGM from the service called NutriSense, and they have a very nice app. Since I got the Stelo, I'm using the app from Dexcom. It is designed for the Stelo, but I don't think it has quite as much functionality as the NutriSense app. One change is that the Stelo updates readings every 15 minutes. However, when it updates the data, it looks like it gives glucose levels at every 5 minutes. The app continues to run on my phone, and the data is automatically sent from the sensor. The last sensor I had was the Freestyle Libre 2. It took readings every 10 minutes and stored data on the sensor for up to 8 hours. In order to get the data, I would have to put my phone up to the sensor. It would then connect to my phone using near-field communication, or NFC. NFC is used for things like secure payments from cell phones. The Stelo instead connects with Bluetooth. And as the user guide states, you need to keep your phone within 20 feet of the sensor at all times. That instruction is a little bit hard for me. One thing that I will point out is that I think the website is terrible, and user support is almost zero. Hopefully, as they get the Stelo in the hands of more people, they'll improve their customer service. The sooner the better as far as I'm concerned. I have one major goal between now and when I start riding across Washington on September 9th. Don't get sick. There are a number of people around me who have gotten COVID recently. It would be a massive disappointment to have everything set and not be able to go due to having COVID. Any suggestion that you might have about how to keep my immune system sharp would be appreciated. You can find my email and the show Instagram links in the show notes. But if you haven't joined the Cycling Over 60 Strava Club, consider doing so and sharing your thoughts there. That way others in the club get to see the info and respond. I love that the club is steadily growing every week. I am always curious about bike tech, and when I saw a Clydesdale bike, I was hopeful I could get someone from Zinn Cycles to come on the podcast. I was thrilled to find out that Lennard Zinn offered to come on. Lennard, in my opinion, is a true pioneer. That is true in the mountain biking world, but also in designing bikes for large people and small people alike. Here is my conversation with Lennard Zinn. It is so cool to have someone join me today who I think has had a massive impact on the world of cycling. Thank you, Lennard Zinn, for taking the time to be here.
You're welcome. Thanks, Tom.
Now, before we get into anything else, tell me about your earliest memory of the bicycle.
Well, probably my earliest memory is getting bright red one under the Christmas tree.
How old were you at that time?
No, I was young. I don't know, 5 or 6 or something like that.
Gotcha. Had you already been riding, or did you need to learn to ride on that
I've
bike?
been figuring it out on my brother's bike.
At one point, you decided to focus your career on bikes. How did that happen?
That's probably a multi-step process. First of all, for some reason, I'm not sure why, I was intrigued by building bike frames. And now when I look back, I'm like, wow, that far back, I did that. When I was a sophomore or maybe junior in college, I applied for a Watson Fellowship to go to Europe to go study frame building. And I didn't get the fellowship, and I guess I completely pretty much forgot about it, but I was intrigued by it to that point. I also had worked with metal a lot, and in as a jeweler, I taught jewelry making even in my spare time at Colorado College through their leisure program, and so I knew how to, work a torch and silver solder things, and cut and hammer and all that. And then in 1980, I won a lot of races and got all sorts of bike parts. And my girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife of 44 years or something, she had a really crappy bike. And I thought, oh, God, I got all these parts. It'd be fun to make her a frame. So I got the Proteus frame building manual, which was a thing at the time. I'm sure it's long out of print. And at the time, I was in the resident training program at the Olympic Training Center and in Colorado Springs. But my alma mater was Colorado College, and I was a physics major there. And so I kind of had access to the physics lab. I was also working there as the paraprofessional in the physics department. And so I set up my dad's torch there and everything, and I made her a frame. And I don't know, I guess I figured, got to build a bike frame once in my life. I didn't really, hadn't gotten to the point of the question that you asked of how did I decide to make it a career. But then 1981, I was racing the Iron Horse Classic. So there's a stage from Durango to Silverton that goes over these two 12,000 foot, almost 11,000 foot passes. Back then, it was a really big race. The prior year, I'd won it, and I'd set the course record by 5 minutes. And now here I was, national team member and on a big trade team, just gotten a brand new bike. That was the first time I would have ridden it in the mountains. I literally just got it from the team. And so and get over the first pass and start going down the other side, and the bike just starts shaking uncontrollably. Like, oh my God. And so I had to put the brakes on, let the group go. Same thing happened on the big descent all the way down into Silverton. It's just shaking like mad. And it was at that moment that I said, God, I could do better than this myself. I'm going to make my own frame. And, for my senior seminar for my physics degree, I'd done a project on the stability of the bicycle. I'd made computer models in Fortran of it, and I'd kind of rigged together an unrideable bike from which you could then learn what it was that made a bike handle properly and ride well. And so I wanted to try out those ideas as well. And I'd already tried them out on what's now my wife's bike, but I wanted to do it for myself in a big size. And anyway, that was sort of the next phase. I ended up in Northern California, I don't know, 5 months, three or 4 months later, because I'd torn my gastrocnemius in the Tour of Ireland stage race, and it just wasn't healing, and I couldn't stand to be around Boulder anymore because I was a bummer to be around my girlfriend, and I wasn't riding, and all my friends there were bike riders, and the trade team I was on was based there, and they were always checking on me, and national team coach was, and I just needed to get out of there, and I drifted out to California. Northern California, was working for a geophysics company, got laid off. Then I just was flipping through the phone book, and I saw Tom Ritchie's name, and I'd seen Ritchie bicycles in the Palo Alto Bike Shop's catalog. I don't know if you ever saw that catalog, but it was, what we all poured over when in the 70s, looking at all these cool bikes in there, mail order catalog. And I just called him up, and he answered, and he said, hello. And I said, is this Tom Ritchie? He said, yeah. The Ritchie that builds bicycles? Yeah. Oh, wow. I had no idea why I'd done it. And I was like, well, do you need any help? And he said, well, actually, a guy just quit today. Yeah. And so he had 2 employees at the time, and one of them had just quit. So I was then his 3rd employee ever. And so, yeah, was then working for him. This was very early in the mountain bike scene when he was partners with Gary Fisher doing Ritchie mountain bikes. Mountain Bikes was Gary Fisher's name, the name of his bike shop in San Anselmo. And anyway, so we were making, I don't know if you've seen recently, Tom Ritchie recently came out with redoing the Bull Moose handlebar, this steel. Do you remember the way those bikes, early mountain bikes had, instead of a stem and a bar, they had a one-piece triangulated thing that came out like this within a bar. All from Tom was all fillet brazed together, but like the stump jumper, which was the bike that was the copy of the Ritchie bikes that Mike Senior had taken to Japan and had it copied to make the stump jumper. That had also, and that's what I was doing actually, was making millions of those handlebars. And then still, I was not thinking of this as a career. I still thought of myself as a bike racer. And then my knee just wasn't getting better out there. My torn gastrocnemius had calcified, and I was on a swim team in Palo Alto, master swim team, trying to work it that way. And I really hate swimming actually, but I just couldn't ride. And at the same time that Andy Pruitt was the head athletic trainer for the women at CU, he's like the guru of bike fit these days, but back then he was, athletic trainer at CU and was a riding buddy. And he told Sunny, my wife, his girlfriend at the time, that if I came back to Boulder, he'd just treat me for free in the field house along with all the co-ed athletes. And so that seemed like a good deal to me. And so I came back to Boulder, and at the same time, my grandmother died and left me $10,000. And I was like, well, what am I going to do with this? Well, I could start a bike company. So that was probably, I still didn't think of it as a career, it wasn't until I was like 40. So this time, 1982, I was 24 years old. And when I was about 40, my dad said, oh my God, you've really made a career out of this bicycle thing. So at that point, I knew it was a career.
Gotcha.
Kind of crept up.
That's awesome. Do you think that your study of physics kind of brought something unique to your craft, to building frames? Do you think that was something that allowed you to see things in a specific way?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, like especially with front end geometry and handling and the whole relationship between the fork offset and the wheel diameter and the head tube angle. Just that was a huge thing that I looked at from a physics perspective, and then I see physics as really being like figuring out how the world works, and so that was always the case with building bikes and designing bikes, is bringing that perspective to it.
A while ago, I had somebody on and they talked about the bicycle as an elegant machine. And I think that's kind of an interesting way to say it. What do you think about that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's nothing like it. There's no conveyance that exists that can carry more than 10 times its own weight. It's probably actually more like 20 times its own weight now when you think of these 16-pound bikes that could carry a 320-pound person. There's, semi trucks. There's nothing that comes close to it. And yeah, the elegance and grace, not both of the bike, but also of the rider is cool.
You talked about mountain biking, and you had an interesting view of mountain biking that many people don't have these days, kind of being at the very genesis of it in the place where it was being formulated. What was that like at that time to see that take off?
Well, it's a lot cooler in retrospect than it was at the time. At the time, it just sort of seemed like the way it was. But like we'd have a Thanksgiving Day group mountain bike ride on Mount Tam. And so there was Tom Ritchie, Gary Fisher, Joe Breeze, Steve Potts, Charlie Cunningham, Mark Slate, Scott Nickel, Ross Schaefer. Everybody was there, that would ultimately be really significant names in the mountain bike business. But at the time, they're like, Joe Breeze is coming over to Tom. He just made his first frame. Maybe it was Steve Potts, one of those two guys, made his first frame and wanted some tips from Tom about like, how do you scale this up? And Tom was very generous with his time about stuff like that. But yeah, it was just pretty amazing, that whole concentration. I mean, it's really kind of like right by the Silicon Valley, and similar in the sense that there's all this somehow magnetic grouping together of all these people with a similar interest, kind of bringing something new out of nothing. And out of the existing bicycle, but I guess, the Silicon Valley people were bringing something out of an existing giant computer.
Yeah, I think that innovation, that interest in innovation, I think there's definitely some real parallels there. In the beginning, it seems like there was, this adaptation of the road bike, to going off road. How soon did it happen that, there's a divergent, we see road bikes and mountain bikes very differently now. How soon did it happen that there was this real divergence? Was it almost immediately, or did it take some time?
Well, from my perspective as a roadie, it was immediate. Tom Ritchie originally made 5 bikes. The first run was 5, but one was for him, one was for Gary Fisher. I don't know where 2 of them went, but the other one went to Chris Kant at Criterium Bike Shop in Colorado Springs. And he was sponsor of the cycling team I was on at the time. When I was over at the shop one day, it was like right next to Colorado College. And when I was over at the shop, he said, what do you think of this? Shows me this bike with knobby tires and stuff. And you can ride it on dirt trails, like hiking trails and stuff. And I'm like, who would want to do that?
It's awesome.
So then when I got to Tom Ritchie, when he said, yeah, a guy quit today, you could come on up. And I go up there, and then I look around, he takes me on a little tour, and I'm like, you mean all you're doing is mountain bikes? I just envisioned making these cool road bikes. And he's like, yeah, there's no business in road bikes anymore. This is where it's at. Oh, geez. So I was reluctant to take the job because I thought, oh, boy. Yeah. Of course, in retrospect, I'm super glad I did. But it was a different time. We'd just ride anywhere, literally anywhere. And then, one time there was a dinner party up there. He lived on the top of the coastal range above Palo Alto, looking down a kind of Half Moon Bays on one side and Palo Alto, Redwood City and stuff is on the other side. And we were at a dinner party at some, people up there tended to have a lot of money, nice house up there. And we were at one of these places, and, I was just kind of a little bit of an outsider, didn't know anybody, and striking up a conversation with one of the homeowners up there. Oh, what do you do? I build these bikes with this guy over there, Tom Ritchie, and we just ride them all over the place. Somehow got on the subject of how we rode them all over up there, and he's, you're the guys that have been riding across my property. Like, oh, I had no concept of trail etiquette, trail access issues or anything. We just literally rode everywhere.
That's hilarious. Oh, I think there's always been this sense that cycling is really a European thing, but mountain biking seemed like, a real American thing. Was that sense there? That was there a division there between kind of road racing and mountain biking as far as Europe versus the US?
Oh yeah, I mean it didn't exist in Europe at the time that I was working for Tom, and my mother's German. I grew up speaking German. I loved going to Europe racing. I just had a pretty Euro kind of view of the cycling world. So that's another reason that there's like mountain bikes, because I really thought of them as, just the clunkers, the pictures of the clunkers that these guys are riding down repack and stuff on, and, in jeans and no helmet and stuff. Well, we didn't really wear helmets then either for racing at that time on the road either. But it was just the clothes, the everything. It just was like, this is not the elegant sport that I love. Shaved legs and all that.
So did that shift for you or
Yeah, I didn't.
yeah.
Now even I hadn't really thought about it until literally we were having this conversation. But that shift happened relatively quickly while I was up there working with Tom. I was just like, these are cool, and you can do all these cool things on them. Yeah.
One thing about you, and you talked about the shimmy that was going on as you were descending on a bike. You're a tall person.
Yes.
Was that always like something about you as you were on the cycling team that you were one of the taller people?
Yeah, I think I was always the tallest. When I won Durango Silverton, I was 6'6" and I weighed 156 pounds. It spurred some of my thinking about the bike because, like, when I was on national team, Eddie Borisevich was the national team coach at the time, Eddie B, and he did the initial positioning of me on my bike for when I joined the team, and I was using 180 cranks. Most people had never even heard of cranks that long, and I had gone to great lengths to get them. And that was the longest that was available, but that just made sense to me, especially with my physics background. It made no sense that I would go through smaller range of angles and relative extension contraction of muscles and stuff than other people. Like, if it worked for them and these guys that win in the Tour de France, that their crank length and their crank circle, the way their feet moved around, why did I have to now work like a sewing machine, on these little short cranks? And so Eddie B positioned me on it. I thought he was going to go, oh, geez, what are these long cranks? He said, oh, you got 180 millimeter cranks. That's fantastic. But they're not long enough for you. I'm like, well, I'm sort of been thinking that, but there's nobody makes any longer than this. He's like, oh yeah, they make, which of course was not the case. But he told me, that you should ride 182.5 for everything and 185 for time trial hill climb. I'm like, okay. But that would always stuck in the back of my mind, until decades later when I was writing for Velo News and I wanted to do a whole article on crank length and test these things. And I built an ergometer that would allow you this whole range of adjustment to be able to fit all kinds of sizes of people with all kinds of sizes of cranks. Because most ergometers, didn't accept standard cranks. They don't have a standard threaded bottom bracket and everything. So I had to build the whole thing, and then got Jeff Boone to make all these cranks from 100 millimeter to 220 millimeters that then I'd do these tests with. And if Eddie B hadn't said those things, I probably would have just maybe stuck with, well, my 180s or improvement over what would have been, but stuck with that.
So you talked about the $10,000, deciding to put that into a company making bikes. Was that the beginning of Zinn Cycles, or when
Yeah,
did that start?
that was it. Then I incorporated, became an S corp. I don't know, a month or two later, by the time I'd gotten a little bit of advice about what to do. And so, yeah, now it's 42 years later. Zinn Cycles is still going strong.
How do you describe Zinn Cycles today? If someone was going to ask you kind of what your focus is at Zinn Cycle?
Well, Still, the majority of our customers are very tall people, but it is changing. One thing that changed it was e-bikes. And I started making e-bikes because I developed a heart arrhythmia. And, Connie Carpenter and Davis Finney are good friends of mine, and they're the winningest bike racers in American history. They're sort of the first couple of cycling. And I used to put on bike camps with them in Italy and stuff. And Davis has Parkinson's and is riding an e-bike, which I didn't know, but he was. And I was telling him about how boring it's gotten me only being able to ride this very small radius near my house and can't ride with anybody else because as soon as I start talking, I forget about paying attention to my heart rate and it skyrockets, and that I needed to be close enough that I could get back home if I went into arrhythmia. And so he's like, well, you need an e-bike. And, it's just in my nature. When I started kayaking, I made my own kayak. When I got into bikes, I made my own bikes. There was no way I was going to go buy an e-bike, particularly in my size. I always figured, same with kayaks and everything, I always figured it wouldn't be one my size anyway. Then after doing that, it started, e-bikes have more of a problem. Like the way my business is still here after 42 years and so many other frame builders have come and gone is that I never tried to compete with big brands in the middle of the market. I looked on the fringes for what they weren't doing. And originally my business was completely making bikes for small people. I sponsored a women's racing team. We created the team. It was the first women's only cycling team in Colorado. And most of my customers were small women at the time. And that was because the big brands were not doing anything for them. The only thing they could get that really fit decently was a Georgina Terry bike, but it had a 24-inch front wheel, and you couldn't race that and get neutral support wheel changes and all that sort of thing. So all these manufacturers made small bikes, but they were kids' bikes. A kid's 10-speed, was not the same quality. And so I was making a really good bike that would fit these really small people. And then at some point, these big manufacturers figured out that women spend a lot of money on bikes, and they started catering to that market. And then that part of my business kind of dwindled. But it had always been from the beginning figuring out how to fix this shimmy problem, which did come from my physics background, was figuring out how to solve that. And there are just so many tall bikes just tend to do that. They would come to me because they were scared to death going downhill on their bike, and also just from getting one that fit them properly. So then it became 100% big and tall bikes for decades. But then once I started making e-bikes have that same problem with too limited range of sizes. Most manufacturers are just not making things in the big or small sizes. And so the fact that I made every size and made a light one, really high performing one that performs like a nice, whatever it's an e-mountain bike or if it's an e-road bike, it performs like a nice road bike, a nice mountain bike or gravel bike or whatever. And so that then brought in a lot of small people again. And then other small people, because of them, started buying normal bikes too. So now we find a pretty interesting mix. Zinn Cycles has 3 brands. The Zinn brand, we make custom titanium, almost all titanium bikes, also some aluminum full suspension bikes. And then we have Clydesdale brand, which is a titanium stock sized range, road bikes, gravel bikes, e-bikes, mountain bikes, fat bikes, all in titanium, and then originally all only size 2XL, 3XL, and 4XL. Now some of those things we go down to smaller sizes, but the idea still is big. So sometimes we get 6 foot tall or 5'10" people who weigh 400 pounds and that kind of thing. So that whole Clydesdale line is designed to be an unbreakable bike, for big people, big and tall people. And then we have this third brand, which is a pretty new thing for us, also titanium, stock size, but it's called Tui, Tui, which is a bird in New Zealand. That's for small people, small gravel bikes, e-bikes, mountain bikes, stock sizes in titanium. So you asked how I would describe it, in a sentence, I guess titanium bikes and e-bikes for everybody, but focused on those that are not that find a hard time getting things from the big companies. We also make our own carbon fork. We don't manufacture it, but that was a project during the pandemic. Business tripled during the pandemic, and I think we were fortunate in that here where we were, we were all socially distanced. I had one guy out in the shop doing the assemblies. I was in here doing design and all that sort of stuff alone. He was out there alone. Nick was working alone at his house. The titanium welder was a one-man shop. The guy making the full suspension aluminum bikes out in Fort Lupton here. He was all one-man shop. So, and then titanium was the only material bikes are made out of that became more abundant and cheaper during the pandemic. And that was because really the only commercial use of titanium tubing is for hydraulic tubing inside of commercial aircraft for running the lifters and the landing gear and all that sort of stuff. And they were just mothballing planes. Nobody was building anything. So people were eager to sell titanium tubing. But since our business was primarily big, tall people, we needed a fork with a long steer. And there was only one on the market that was long enough. And I designed pretty much all the really tall bikes, oversized 2XL to use, which was the Envy all-road fork, all-road disc fork. But then we couldn't get it during the pandemic. That was just one of the many things. But that would completely stop us in our tracks because, other stuff that when we couldn't get chains, we'd figure out something. When we couldn't get rim strips, we'd figure out something, but that was a big stopping problem. And so, and early in the pandemic, the carbon manufacturers were really desperate because they didn't know what was going to happen next. And all of a sudden, nobody was ordering anything. Nobody knew what was happening. So I negotiated a great price on getting these forks made. And I worked out the design, had the EFBE test lab in Germany, which is like the premier bike testing lab. Keep doing the testing to make a fork that was really designed for super big, heavy people. That we didn't stop at the test level that all the other guys did. We went 50% higher and then made the steer tube much thicker. So if people stack a whole bunch of spacers up above the headset to get their handlebars way up there, if they're buying it as an aftermarket fork in order to do that we didn't need to worry about the steer breaking. And also that the steer was then like all of the forks are 300 to 350 millimeter long steers, which wasn't enough for most of our bikes. And then that one Envy fork was 400. Well, this Zinn Duro fork, we make 450, and we make it instead of the 140, 160 millimeter rotors, make it take 160, 180, because for really big people, they need bigger disc brakes as well. And so I guess I see Zinn Cycles as a company that tries to produce solutions for people that have, can't otherwise find a bike that's right for them. And, I do a lot of customer fittings. Now got this computerized fit bike, that moves in response to typing on the keyboard. I do lots of fits for people on non-Zinn bikes now. I've really completely turned over the business end of things to Nick. And so I'm just doing bike designs, bike fittings, writing for the blog and things like that. But I don't have to spend so much time paying bills and ordering parts and that sort of thing. And so I'm freed up to do things like bike fittings, which, I've been doing forever, but just on our own bikes. And now it's kind of fun to do it.
That's awesome. It's a really cool business story, really. I mean, what a unique transition and a time when like you get this opportunity where titanium is more available, and everything. It's just a really interesting business story. What is it about titanium? What are the properties that make it a good material?
Well, one is that it can never rust or corrode. and it doesn't actually need any paint, which is really nice because that was always a hassle. Painting bikes myself or getting them painted and or powder coated or whatever. It's really the liveliness of it. So there's the liveliness of it is a ride characteristic that you can hear really if you had tuning forks made out of aluminum, steel, and titanium. The aluminum one, I think you can kind of imagine it sort of goes thwap, and the carbon one would do the same thing, even more deader sound. And then steel is a nice, bright, ringing sound. And then titanium, it rings so brightly, it's like it's almost deafening. Like if we knock a bunch of titanium tubes on the floor, it just rings like ding, and everybody's covering their ears, and it's quite amazing. And that sort of liveliness and energy transfer you can really feel in the bike. And then its strength to weight ratio is super impressive. So it's 2/3 the density of steel, whereas aluminum is 1/3 the density of steel. But where steel that's used in bike frames, high-end steel, is up close to 200,000 psi tensile strength, the best aluminums that are used in bike frames, strongest aluminums used in bike frames, are maybe 40,000 psi, so 5 times less. So even though here it's 1/3 the density, you got to use a whole bunch of it in order to not have it break. But titanium has a tensile strength like 150,000 psi, so up close to steel, but at only 2/3 the weight and 2/3 the density. And then another thing that's great about it is elongation. So you can kind of understand elongation because you know better than to use a really fine kitchen knife as a screwdriver, because you'll break the tip off. And the tip is brittle because they push the tensile strength up so high with that in order that it'll really hold an edge. And they did it at the expense of the elongation, which is how much something can stretch. And when you let go of the force, that it'll return to its original shape, or bend and then let go and return to its original shape. And so when you get to this really, really high brittleness, then you're talking, 2 or 3% elongation is all. If you stretch it or bend it 2 or 3% beyond its original shape, it's not going to go back. It's going to either break off or deform permanently. And, the steel that's used in bikes, they bring that compromise back some. So that's like 7% elongation, and you get 200,000 psi tensile instead of, 350,000 on the knife blade. But aluminum, those high strength aluminums that they need in order to have that bike be strong enough and not have it be heavier than a steel bike, has an elongation like 2 or 3%. And then, of course, carbon, you can design flex into it and all that, but if it takes a big impact, that's it. It doesn't have spring back to it. You delaminate, crush fibers, whatever. And titanium has, rather than 2% or 7% or what elongation, it's 25% elongation, which means that it can just be bent all over the place, and you let go and it'll go back to its original shape. So like if you're building a bike and you build it crooked, or if somebody brings in a bent bike, the steel bike, you can cold set it, you can bend it out, and it'll come out to and hold this set. And an aluminum bike, yeah, you can do that to a certain point, but if the tensile strength is so low, the yield strength, that all of a sudden it'll go and it'll bend, a kink in it and stay there. And titanium, you can yank on it and bend and do all sorts of stuff, and it just keeps going back to the way it was. And we used to see lots of bikes in the 90s where people would drive into their garages with them on the roof, because all the bike racks were on the roof then, they weren't on the hitch. And if it happened with a carbon bike or an aluminum bike, the bike just broke. And if it happened with a steel bike, they would get a little bit crinkled. You get a stretch point at the top of the head tube, top tube joint, and a little bubble on the bottom, same on the down tube. And, the bike would be permanently screwed up. The head angle would be too steep then, and it would, the tire would hit your toe and stuff like that. But titanium bikes, we had people that would come in here with all kinds of stuff. One guy had even totaled his car because at the time the roof rack, the cars had the gutters, and the roof racks clamped into the gutters, and it just tore the gutters right off of his car, and broke the rack, broke handlebars, all sorts of stuff, and the frame. Apparently it would have been cool to see it in slow motion because it probably just went like this, and then when all the straps and started breaking on the roof rack, and the roof rack broke away from the roof of the bike of the car, then all of a sudden, bing! It would have just boinged back out to its original shape, and so I love that. It's a lifetime material. It rides wonderfully. You basically can't ever dent it or break it or bend it, and gives me confidence, given that we're making bikes for really, really big people, that even if we do sometimes make steel bikes we still do some steel bikes, and some people insist on it, but still there's plenty of them that people weren't careful about how they dealt with water. Water would get inside the seat tube, and then they'd be hanging it from their ceiling by the front wheel, and so the back of the seat tube is like horizontal, and the water that is collected in there from riding in the rain and having water get thrown into the slot behind the seat post, that would be collecting there. And how we would know about it is they'd call us up and they'd say, "Hey, the paint's bubbling on the back of my seat tube." Oh, really? Oh, no, that scratching our head trying to figure out how that happened. Then they send the bike in. You just push your finger at one of those bubbles, and it just goes right through the tube because the whole back of it's all rusted out. And you just can't. Things like that just don't happen with titanium bikes. And of course, you have less margin for that when you're really big. Depending on having the full strength of the material that you're riding on.
I had somebody talk about how excited they were to get their Clydesdale bike. This was someone that was big and just thrilled that, he was getting a bike that he felt really confident in and felt really fit him. You must hear that a lot.
Oh, yeah. A lot of people think, "Oh, God, thank you for being here. Like, if it weren't for you, I wouldn't be able to get a bike." So I love that. Yeah. I mean, there was at one time that I tried to quit this business. 1994, we had a shop up in North Boulder then, and it just was a struggle financially. I'd gone through a clinical depression. It was just like, it was just rough. I closed the business, sold most of the equipment, a few things like the welder and stuff I couldn't let go, but most stuff I sold to the people that worked for me and helped them set up their own frame building businesses. And I was just going to go. By that point, I was writing for Velo News a lot, and I was just going to be doing that. But really what happened was so many of my prior customers already, but at that point, I'd been in business for 12 years. There was already so many tall guys out there who would call me up and they'd go, "Oh my God, you can't stop. You can't stop doing this because that's you're the only guy that would make a bike that worked for me." Then I figured out a way to do it and to make it profitable and all that and make it sustainable, and kept going.
Well, that's awesome. I'm glad you did, for sure. Do you see some technological advancements coming up that are going to contribute to frame building?
Well, I'm sure we're going to go further with 3D printing. As it is, that's made a huge difference in our business recently. Like I told you, when I decided to make it myself an e-bike, well, I was going to make it out of titanium because that's what we make bikes out of. I called up Bosch and asked them to send me a motor. And first of all, that was the first roadblock because they said, "No, we can't do that. We're not set up to sell the small frame builders. We're only set up to sell the big manufacturers." And I talked him into, like, "Dude, you got to do this because pretty soon other frame builders besides me are going to want these things." And so he said, "Well, give me 6 months." And then in 6 months, he set up Ceres as the distributor with the hazmat certification to be able to ship the batteries. And he set up QVP to do small parts, and set up Magura USA to do like dealer training and warranty service and stuff. But during that time, I was figuring out, well, what am I going to do if I get this motor? How am I going to attach it to the bike? To machine that out of titanium be ridiculously expensive. First for the programming and all that to figure out exactly how to do it. But then, you'd be starting with a big block of titanium, which is expensive stuff, and you'd be throwing out 95% of it, not to mention all the machining time involved and the special cutters that you need to cut titanium because it tends to smear rather than cut. So you got a super, super sharp cutter. And then the upfront cost to mold it or to forge it or anything. But 3D printing, wow, you just had to have the exact design of it and find somebody that could do it. And actually, the company that makes the titanium 3D printer in Germany was who's been making those 3D printing those for us. And then, they said it would be $5,000 for one of these things. So my bike was going to be pretty expensive, my e-bike, or $7,000 for 10. So that's how I got in the e-bike business, because I had these other nine motor mounting nodes that I needed to sell, and so kept going with it. And then by the time I sold that ninth one, then Bosch had changed the motor. It was a smaller, lighter motor, and I had to change the design anyway of the 3D print.
That's fantastic.
So that's a big one, 3D printing, and I do think that that's going to continue to have it's hard for me to predict how, but it's just inevitable that kind of thing is going to show up more in bike building. And we already use 3D printed dropouts too, and 3D printed head tube ends and 3D printed mounts for things on the bike. And, I think it's really in the area of carbon manufacturing, because really that's where, if you look at the business as a whole, not my business, the business as a whole, that's kind of the direction it goes, because the labor required is less skilled. You can have much lower costs, but you end up with a lighter product that you can sell for more. And the other thing that costs you more to make, and those upfront costs to produce the molds or whatever to make one-off bikes in carbon, that's going to somehow come down. I see that is sort of another thing that would happen.
One of the huge contributions that I think you've made to cycling is helping people understand how bikes work and how to fix them. How did you start writing guidebooks?
My wife was a teacher, and this was before Barnes and Noble and Amazon and all that sort of stuff. So she and all the teachers would go to this one bookstore in Boulder called Discount Books. And it was owned by a guy that I went to high school with in Los Alamos, New Mexico, who happened to be a bike nut. And he read all my articles in Velo News. And so my wife would go in there to buy a bunch of books for her classroom. And he would say, Lennard needs to write a book, and he needs to call it Zinn and the Art of Mountain Bike Maintenance. She'd come home and tell me that, and I'd chuckle, and that would be the end of it. And 6 months later, she'd go back in to get more books for her class. Same thing would happen. And one of the times she went in, and he'd made up a dummy cover of the book, Zinn and the Art of Mountain Bike Maintenance. She brought that home, and somehow having that sitting there on the table, like, I could do that. That's how it started.
What a good idea he had to do that. Why do you think it's important for people to understand bikes more, how they work more, understand how to do their own maintenance? What's your thought on that?
Well, I think it gives them power. Like, I drive an electric car, and I don't like the fact that there's so many things on it that I don't understand, that if it broke, I'd have no idea what to do about it. And some things out of my control, like where if charger stations are screwed up or whatever, and I'd be stranded. And a bicycle, it inherently, one of the reasons it gives you so much freedom is the sense that you can go a long way, but you can always depend on yourself to get yourself back on it. And then it's an extension of that if something goes wrong with it, that you can fix it and still get yourself back. That, I think, is the biggest reason. For me, that drives me for sure.
I love it. You had mentioned using an e-bike because of some health issues. I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about cycling as an activity for older people, kind of including the fact that, there is pedal assist out there. If you have something going on, and maybe a lot of different things that could warrant pedal assist. Do you see cycling as a particularly good activity for older adults?
Yeah, I definitely do. I mean, it's easier on your joints than just about anything except except maybe swimming. Swimming actually is hard on your shoulder joints, but leg joints and stuff. But you don't have to have a pool. You don't have to be in chlorinated water. You don't have to, all that stuff that goes along with that. You get to be outside, where running and even walking, are more wear and tear on your joints. Provided on the bike you get everything lined up properly, that you're not grinding away at something because your knee swings out or your foot's twisted weird or something like that, but that you get everything lined up, you're properly fit on the bike. And you can go places, you can go interesting, cool places with it. And then with the e-bike, I never envisioned myself riding an e-bike until I was. And then once I was like, God, why didn't I do this years ago? I mean, it's fantastic. I can do any ride I want to do. I mean, it's just a matter of how many batteries I'm willing to carry, spare batteries, if I want to go really a long way. But, Trail Ridge Road is the highest mountain pass in the U.S. I can ride up there and I can, if Peter Sagan comes to town, I can keep up with him. I can do any riding I want. There's nothing that limits you to how hard you pedal. You still get to choose that. As long as you don't have one with a throttle. That I'm not into the e-bikes with throttles, but pedal assist e-bike, you can still pedal as hard as you want, but you are going faster than you would have with only your pedaling, which I find freeing and also a way to look around and smell the flowers and enjoy the scenery more than just being constantly, redlined going up a big mountain. I'm 66 years old. I have a heart arrhythmia. And yeah, I go on rides that most people would never consider going on. I think that I could keep doing this till at least 75 or something, maybe till I'm 80, riding high in the mountains and everything. And otherwise, I don't know how old you are, but you're probably familiar with, how constantly there's some aching something, something doesn't work like the way it used to. And to still be able to do some things that you did when you were really young is great.
Yeah, I love it. I see people all the time. We just did a ride 3 days on a tour. So I'm 61. And, there are a lot of people on that ride that were quite a bit older than me. And it was just, several of them had pedal assist. And it's just really good to see people out there that would not be on a bike ride otherwise, and maybe not being active otherwise. So it's really good to see it. Thank you so much, Lennard, for coming on. Can you talk about, you do some writing, and how do people follow Zinn Cycles and kind of follow what you're writing about?
So I'm no longer writing for Velo News. I'm now writing my own thing on Substack. So lennardzinn.substack.com. I have a weekly tech Q&A with Lennard Zinn that I do on that every Monday, and post some other things as well as that. But mostly that's what I'm doing. Is people ask me questions about bike stuff, and I answer them. And then, zinncycles.com is our website, and there's lots of content there about the things that I do. And there's a blog that I have there, stuff that I'm thinking about bikes, or why we do certain things or all that. And then my books, Zinn and the Art of Road Bike Maintenance. I just did the 6th edition of that, is now out. And Zinn and the Art of Mountain Bike Maintenance is also 6th edition is out in the market. And then I wrote The Haywire Heart, which is about how masters endurance athletes are much more prone to heart arrhythmias and why, and what you can do about it. And so those are other ways.
Again, I just think that you have contributed massively to cycling, and just even the fact, like I said, the people discover a Clydesdale bike and they're bigger and get to experience that. I mean, that alone is such a huge thing. But you're riding and everything, so I want to thank you for that. And again, I want to thank you for taking the time to be on here.
You're welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
All right, take care now.
Bye.
I love what Lennard shared about being involved in designing and building bikes for years, and then only really realizing it was his career when his father pointed it out decades after Lennard started. That feels to me like Lennard was just by nature a bike guy. I feel bad for Lennard that his aspirations of professional racing were interrupted by injury. However, I wonder if the world wouldn't have Zinn cycles if Lennard hadn't needed to find another profession. Like he said, without his bikes, there would be a lot of people who would have to put up with bikes that just don't fit. It is such a valuable combination for Lennard to be very tall himself and also have the knowledge to understand the forces that impact larger bike frames, and to be able to see the interaction between taller people and the bike through his own experience. And of course, it is awesome that his experience also led to smaller people getting bikes that fit them as well. No matter your size or cycling ability, I hope the week ahead is filled with some incredible rides on a bike that fits you well. And remember, age is just a gear change.